Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to share the findings of this first ever patient study that patients have done on their own. I'm sure the doctors will have a lot to say about the study. We just wanted to do an indicative study of what the patients felt about Sjogren syndrome. I realized that we will need to do a much more in-depth study, and we will, of course, follow this up with. But we just wanted to do a study to do a kind of, which would give us a guideline to how to do studies. One of the reasons we took up this study was basically to find out how people felt about Sjogren syndrome and what were the topics that they were interested in uh, when they attended programs and events. And one of the reasons we've taken up GI issues today is because that was the demand which came from patients. Now, let me just start the presentation with sharing the slides. Uh, if you take a look at this slide, I think it tells you all. Uh, there are multiple perceptions about Sjogren syndrome, and that is what makes it such a complex disease. When doctors are asked to talk about Sjogren syndrome, the words they use are the one that you can see there: complex, systemic, autoimmune, chronic, things like that. When patients are asked about Sjogren syndrome, they're more concerned about the way the disease affects them, how there is a loss of confidence, how there is dryness, pain, feeling lonely, feeling tired all the time, being angry, feeling guilty about being ill, and so many other things. And if you ask society, even family members do not really understand this disease, which they cannot see. And that is really the vein of Sjogren syndrome. People label patients as being weak, as being lazy, as being shirkers, good for nothings. And this is what causes a lot of emotional burden in addition to the physical burden that the patients face. So Sjogren syndrome is different to different people. And I think that is why it is so important to understand the patient's perspective about Sjogren syndrome. Uh, when we talk about patients' perspective, let me first talk about why it is so important to listen to patients. We greatly appreciate the efforts made by researchers and scientists and medical professions to help improve the quality of our life. But many times we also feel that people do not, or even doctors do not really understand all that we go through, the burden of disease that we bear. And we feel that patient reported symptoms are stronger indicators of quality of life as compared to systemic manifestations, as is said by some scientists in a study report which has come from it. Before I go to the next point, I just want to ask, are you seeing the entire slide on your screen? Or because I am kind of getting not an entire slide on my screen. Is that okay?
We can see it.
Full slide is visible.
Okay, fine. So the reason why patient's perspective is important is that very often the patient's experiences are trivialized by doctors, trivialized by families, and trivialized by society. A comparative study of patients with the other connective tissue diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, systemic sclerosis, lupus, and Sjogren's, which was undertaken, showed that Sjogren's showed the lowest vitality in social function. Sjogren's patients were found to have the lowest levels in vitality and social function, and the second lowest levels after systemic sclerosis. And yet, uh, this remains one of the least prioritized diseases when it comes to talking about rheumatic diseases. even though we are supposed to be almost ranking equally in prevalence to rheumatoid arthritis. That means there are a large number of patients. Very few get diagnosed, as all the doctors have told us before my talk, that it's difficult to diagnose, and why they have explained to us very well. But the fact remains that because many patients do not get diagnosed, the burden of illness is never really calculated and never really understood. And a greater understanding of of the complexities of Sjogren's can only happen if the experience of the patients and the knowledge of the doctors is both seen together. And therefore, it is all the more important to have dialogues like this, where patients and doctors can talk to each other. Going back to the study, I don't want to dwell too much on the details, but these were the objectives. The methodology that we used was an online survey, and we had a virtual sharing session where about 25 participants from all over the world participated and shared their stories and views. We had in-depth interviews with individual patients, and Radhika here will share with us some of the learnings that she has had while doing these in-depth interviews. The limitations of the study, of course, are due to the fact that we are able to reach only those who had access to technology and were English and Hindi speaking. So we definitely need a much bigger and a greater study to say that this is the impact of uh, on Sjogren syndrome patients. But this is an indicative study, if I may use that term. The study findings are now, we looked at, we got several responses, but finally, when we did the analysis, my colleague Daksha Bhatt has helped extensively with this, along with Radhika. The analysis was based on 62 valid responses. 17 patients declined to answer questions on how Sjogren's impacted their lives. These were the questions which included personal questions about how there was an impact on their personal lives, relationships, and things like that. The gender profile of the study showed that there were 94% females to 6% male. In fact, after this also, we've been getting a lot of responses from male patients. So I'm beginning to think whether we really are going to have a ratio of more than 9:1 that we classically have, because a lot of male patients are registering as patients now. So maybe it is that they were not getting diagnosed early. So that's just an early thought. But yes, that seems to be more male patients registering for Sjogren's as Sjogren's patients. 29% of the respondents were between the age group of 20 to 40. Dr. Sandhya told us that most patients are between the age group of 30 to 40, which is already 10 years earlier than the European cohorts. But we are finding patients who are even in their 20s, and that is very striking, because their entire lives they have to deal with this disease. And I think we really need to start taking into consideration that Sjogren's is much more than a disease of dryness and does affect lives in many different ways. If we look at respondents by region, we will see that I think the charts are self-explanatory. We have people from all over India, with the largest cohort being from Western India. 42% have been living with Sjogren's for 10 plus years. Now, that should be an encouraging thing for the younger patients, those who have been newly diagnosed, that the myth that Sjogren's is life-threatening is not true. People can lead near normal lives, and we have amongst us half the population, which are what I would call veteran Sjogren's patients or champions. 16% of patients have been diagnosed uh, with less than 2 years of uh, diagnosis. So that means these are new patients, and these are the patients that we give a lot of attention to, because they need support in the initial years. Their families need to provide them with support in the initial years, and that's why this is, I think, one of the most important slides in the presentation. If you notice, the classical symptoms of sicca fatigue and joint pains have, of course, emerged as the most bothersome for most patients, with severity of dry mouth and dry eyes as being reported the highest. But it is also interesting to see that people have reported digestive issues as the next most bothersome symptom. Now, I would like Dr. Kurian to help us understand how many of these symptoms that we experience on a daily basis are actually serious. Because it could be that these are non serious symptoms, but the fact that they happen every single day and affect our lives is probably what bothers a lot of us on a daily basis. And therefore, I think we need a different parameter of looking at quality of life, because even if the symptoms are not serious or organ threatening or things like that, but some things which bother you on a daily basis can really erode the quality of life and the happiness of patients. And I think that is something that, as a patient representative, I would like to point out to the doctors here. Mental health and gynecological issues have come up as also major things. Now, as a Sjogren's patient, I know that doctors are concerned about lung involvement, kidney involvement, heart involvement, neurological involvement, and these are more serious indicators. But as a patient, I realize that when we talk about mental health and gynecological issues, when we talk about UTI, these are something which affect our quality of life. And that is why my request to doctors is to also look at these when we are dealing with looking at the well being of the Sjogren's patient. A lot of patients have coexisting conditions, and most of the ones that are mentioned here are very well recorded by the doctors. But it was interesting to see, and this is important for the patients to understand, that more than 20% patients do have rheumatoid arthritis, thyroid imbalance, and hypertension as coexisting conditions. In this cohort that we had, a lot of patients, very few patients showed the rest of the conditions, but this is a very small cohort, so we cannot make any judgments based on this data, except for the fact that, yes, rheumatoid arthritis and thyroid seem to be the most common coexisting conditions. This, I think, is one of our important findings, which we are happy to share with both the patients and the doctors. Like I said before, we believe that Sjogren's is a life-altering condition. Even if it is not a life-threatening condition, it is definitely a life-altering condition. And therefore, 91% of patients have had moderate to severe negative impact on their life due to Sjogren's. We can always argue saying that many other diseases have severe impact, and Sjogren's impact is not that severe. But that is a matter of looking at it from a point of view of life threatening ideas. I would like to look at it also from the point of view of daily living and the point of view of quality of life. So let us keep that in mind. 37% reported a negative impact on career. And as we find younger and younger patients getting affected by Sjogren's, we must realize that this number may even go up. So we need to look at that. Sjogren's affects families, as I said in the beginning also. 40% of patients said that their family relationships and social interactions were affected by Sjogren's. And this results in a huge emotional burden. Just to give an example of the kind of stories that we heard, I'll now request Radhika to just share a few stories of what she heard from Sjogren's patients.
Yeah,
Radhika, over to
sure.
you.
Yeah. So thanks, Kirtida. I'm going to take off from Kirtida and what she said that, literally Sjogren affects families. It's not just the member, but it's also the families which get impacted. And when we talk of, disabilities being invisible, what is so sad to note is that literally they are also invisible to their families. Almost out of, all the people that we spoke to, almost 50% talked about how their families had been extremely supportive, and that had really helped them to lead a good quality of life. But there was another 50% that spoke about the debilitating impact that families relationships had on their lives. So just to cite, we had I spoke to one senior teacher. She was an academician, and she spoke about how she was prone to listening to insensitive comments by her family all the time, and difficulties with accommodations at work. She says she's short and her husband is tall, so literally, the house is not friendly for her access. So the things are put away and stacked away, on top shelves, which she finds very, very difficult to access, and that itself is very stressful for her. I spoke to a young daughter whose mother is impacted with Sjogren's, and she spoke about how her father was literally always telling her and her mother about how the mother was incapable. As it is, the patient is low on confidence, and further, these insensitive comments can really erode the confidence even further. And she also spoke about how the father did not even take them out for outings on holidays to mingle socially, and how that had an impact on the children who now find themselves incapable of making friends. And she says that even though my mother's condition, because of after years and years of listening to verbal discouragement, to stress, she now, reels through a lot of mental anxiety and depression. And this is something that is so simple to correct. Just simple words of encouragement from the family. Societally, I've had people who spoke about, as them being classified as not being suitable marriage material, and that is so disheartening if we meet these societal barriers. The last thing that we spoke about, Kirtida says that 37% talk about career changes. So while I did chance upon two patients who, had really gone through a difficult time trying to complete their education, there were more that I encountered who talked about career issues, and they said that uh, uh, you know full-time working they found was difficult because of the common syndrome of fatigue. But even amongst them, I chanced upon many members actually, who looked at alternative career paths which were physically less demanding. I spoke to an executive who worked at a ticketing agency, and she has moved on to become a full-time yoga facilitator who really inspires and helps people in their journeys. I have also spoken to a dentist who found it initially difficult to move careers, but later on she has now moved into becoming a successful content writer and blogger, and what a chic career to have as well. I have also spoken to a fashion consultant who continues to make waves. She has not changed her career paths, but she has understood that her condition requires certain accommodations, certain compromises at work that she would need to make. She has learned to accept her condition and to prioritize herself. So, these are some of the amazing journeys that I've, hit upon as I spoke to many people. And I think to me, I came up with the 5-point marker, which I feel is so important for, all of us, not just patients, but also us as a society to look at, awareness, 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 much more. A lot of awareness needs to be generated amongst the community, amongst patients, and even in the far out areas, even amongst the doctors, the medical community. Dietary changes and yoga, that's one thing very important for patients. Acceptance of their condition, that's another one. Prioritizing the self, and last but not the least, being positive. So with that, I'd hand it back to Kirtida.
Thank you, Radhika. Uh, so let's move on. I think your stories told us a lot more than the figures did. So, impact of treatment, I think this is one slide which I love to tell all the new patients that there is hope. And when you get diagnosed initially, life is very difficult. uh, and you do have to learn to manage your symptoms and learn to adjust to the medication and things like that. But with proper treatment, lifestyle changes, and a positive attitude, you can significantly improve the quality of your life over the years. And 84% people actually said that. So that is, I think, a wonderful way to realize that diagnosis and treatment is extremely important for us Sjogren's patients. I'd like to end with a few learnings and recommendations. I won't get into the basics, which is about how we need awareness and we need upgradation of skills and things like that. Just close the slides. It's okay. What I really wanted to say was we need to work together. I think doctors and patients need to work together. Need to think about ways to conquer Sjogren's together. There are many things that we need to do, probably like the countries in the Western world are already doing uh, special treatment guidelines which are focused with the taking into consideration the realities of that country. I think we could do that in India, because we are realizing that younger lot of patients are being are uh, getting affected, and therefore we need different ways to deal with Sjogren's, not only medically but also to support them socially and career wise and all. I think one of the other important things that we've been currently working on as the rheumatic diseases patient group, the collective that we are forming, uh, we need to find ways in which our rheumatic conditions can be treated under as kind of disabilities under the RPWD Act. And if we could provide some kind of accommodations, especially for those who have chronic illnesses. See, at the moment, we don't exist in the data of government records, whether it is non-communicable diseases or rheumatic diseases. In fact, it's very interesting that we even filed RTIs, and we tried to find out what provisions there were for rheumatic conditions, and there are none. They don't even have us on records. So, is there a way that we can make the country more aware about people who suffer from rheumatic diseases? And now I'm talking about all rheumatic diseases, Sjogren's included. And if we could find a way in which we could have some kind of specific accommodations that people can get at their workplaces, which could be something like flexible hours or extra leave when they are sick or something like that, or a small timings which can be or working from home. I think that is something which COVID has now taught us. So if we could do some of those kind of things, and if doctors could support us in identifying that these really need to happen, I think that would help us a long way in going ahead. In conclusion, I'd just like to say that as we've realized and as we heard from the doctors, that only a few percent of Sjogren's patients have very serious disease. But at the same time, a large number of patients have disease which affects them on a daily basis. And therefore, the burden of disease that they carry on a daily basis is very high. And therefore, the kind of understanding and support that they need is also very high. I think one of the things that most of us patients feel and feel very, very strongly about is that we remain invisible. We remain invisible to the family, we remain invisible to society, our plight remains invisible even to doctors. And that, I think, is one of the things that we need correction in. We need to be taken more seriously. Amongst the rheumatic conditions that generally get talked about, Sjogren's never finds a place. Whenever there's a seminar or workshop, everything else gets talked about, but Sjogren's never gets talked about. And what I sincerely feel as the voice of patients with Sjogren's is that if a little understanding, a little support, and a little sensitivity was given to us, a little importance in medical facilities and getting targeted treatment is given to us, we will be able to lead lives which are near normal. We would become a part of society. We would not kind of vanish and become invisible from society, but we could actually contribute to society. So we need very little from all of you. We need attention from the doctors and researchers. We need attention from the family and sensitivity from the family and society. We need little, but we need that little very, very much. So with that, I'd like to end and I hand over to the moderator. Thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you.